Hi, everybody. We went over the poetic form practice together as a class pretty much on Tuesday, but I thought I'd make a video as well, just going through it in case you needed a review of what we talked about or in case you missed class that day. So we talked about several different things on this assignment, but the first one was some of the parts of a sonnet, some of the characteristics it typically has. We talked about stanzas first and how many lines a stanza tends or a sonnet tends to have, as well as how many stanzas it is typically separated into. I gave you an example down here. This is a very famous sonnet. You might have heard it before. But as you can see, it is separated into three different full stanzas. These are also called quatrains, and they are 4 lines each. And then you're going to see a rhyming couplet at the end that looks something like this. So it's only 2 lines, but total these make up 14 lines, and they are separated in this way. Now, one thing that I will point out that I think I forgot to mention on Tuesday, sometimes there are different types of sonnets. So this would be a typical English sonnet. You can also see types like the one that I have on your study guide that deviate slightly from this pattern. You'll still see it looking very similar, just it won't be broken up in quite the same way. But this is an example of what a sonnet traditionally might look like. So I asked you questions down here about the sonnet that we read together. It was called Sonnet with Bird. And in fact, I was having you guys think about whether it even is a traditional sonnet or not. The first question I asked was, does it have 14 lines? And the answer was kind of. The poem is in 14 sections. When you look in it, it's got each of those sections numbered. But technically, those aren't all individual lines. They're certainly not separated the way that you see up here. And each of those sections is also several sentences long. So it kind of took the idea of having 14 lines and then put its own spin on that. Coming off of that, do you see the verses grouped together into 3 stanzas as you see above? The answer is not exactly here. Certainly when you look at the poem visually, the poem is not separated out into chunks, again, like you see up here. There's nothing like this going on with the way that visually the poem looks. That being said, if you look at the topic of some of the lines of the poem, you might notice that there are groups in terms of what the poem is talking about. It kind of goes through different topics as it goes. And in that sense, maybe it's got some sort of stanza thing going on, but definitely not in a traditional way. And finally, I asked if you saw a couplet of 2 lines at the end. Now, this one, I would say you kind of do. Again, not visually. You don't see the couplet set apart by itself like this. But when you look at what the last 2 sections are talking about, so when you go to that number 13 in the poem, it does switch topics. It starts talking about the comparison between quails and Native Americans, which is what the poem wraps up with. So it kind of has this idea of a couplet, even if it doesn't look like one. So to summarize what's going on here, whoops, I did not mean to do that. To summarize what's going on here, this is definitely not a traditional sonnet by any means. It's almost more that it took the idea of a traditional sonnet like this one up here and then ran with it. It just kind of did its own thing and had its own interpretation. Moving down, one other part that is important for the format of sonnets is the rhyme scheme. And rhyme scheme, that is the pattern in which the ends of each line rhyme with each other. This is a really typical one that you might see here with, again, the same sonnet. So you'll notice here is mostly it goes through alternating in the poem. So for instance, the first and third line rhyme here, and then the second and fourth. And you see that same pattern happening in each stanza, except the end. Again, the couplet at the end is usually special in some way. And certainly in this case, you see that both lines right after another rhyme. So that's the one place where it goes slightly different in the poem. But overall, you've got this really nice, neat pattern as you go through. And the way that that is typically denotated in when we're talking about rhyme scheme in poems is we use letters. So each different pair of words that rhymes is assigned a letter. And then I can actually write out what the rhyme scheme is like I did up here using those letters. So that's where that comes from. And again, this is a traditional sonnet. So I'm going to go down and think about sonnet with bird. Does it rhyme? And there's not even a kind of to this question. The answer is no. There is no rhyme going on in this poem. That is not something that the poet decided to do. I did ask you why you thought the poet chose to do that. And this one I'm ultimately leaving up to you. This is up to your interpretation because we can't know for sure. But a possible answer is that he was trying to almost take this form of an English sonnet, because this is an English sonnet, by the way. And if you'll remember, this poem is set in England. So maybe he was trying to take this very traditionally British thing and put his own spin on it. And he didn't want it to be too close to the original British version, because that's not really the point of the poem. But that is just my interpretation. That could be wrong as well. All right, scrolling down, the other part of this sheet, we're looking at free verse poetry, which is entirely different from a sonnet. Free verse poems do not follow a set pattern at all. They're very free. The poet can kind of do what they want to do. They can experiment, and they usually do so with things like rhythm and form. They experiment with word choice and the way that the poem flows along, the way it sounds. And one way that they can do that is by using end-stopped lines versus enjambed lines. This is looking at the end of each line, just the word at the end of each line. And the main question you're asking yourself is, does the line stop right there? Is there punctuation? Does it finish up a certain thought? Or does it extend into the next line of the poem and kind of flow into it? So end stop lines are these ones that end with punctuation, typically, and are, again, wrapping up a certain thought. So you see an example of that down here. My mother roared like the ocean. Sounds like a thought onto itself, sounds like its own sentence. And it ends with a comma, so that is end stopped. No, no, it's their beach. Again, it's end stopped. It sounds like its own sentence, and it ends with a period. So I highlighted all of those red. Enjambed lines, on the other hand, flow into the next line of the poem, and they don't sound correct on their own. So I have an example of an enjambed line here. With a wooden board, he smooths. You'll notice that that doesn't sound like a complete sentence on its own, and there is no punctuation mark after smooths. It kind of flows into this next line of the poem. So I highlighted this green to show that this is an enjambed line. Now, when I read both of these together, you'll notice they sound complete. With a wooden board, he smooths away all footprints. You can hear that when you read it out loud. So footprints is, in fact, end stopped, like these examples above. But smooths, this one is enjambed. So the last thing I had you do was practice here was practice color coding fences, which is the other poem that we read. And you were just telling me if you saw these lines being enjambed or end stopped and highlighting them accordingly. So I'll just go through here and do the rest of these examples that we did not do together. This first one we did do together in class. Laughter was end stopped, hotel is enjambed, and dollars is end stopped as well. Going through, makes is going to be enjambed. There is no punctuation after it, and it flows into the next line of the poem here. However, them, you're going to notice there's a period after it, and it does not go into the next line of the poem. It stops there. It finishes up a particular thought. So them is going to be red. That is end stopped. These next two examples were in there for you already. Now with this next stanza, there is a lot of enjambment going on here. You should have had a lot of green because not much punctuation after these first couple lines, and they all flow together. I'll read them as an example in a second so you can hear that. But in fact, you have 4 enjambed lines in a row here. And they're all enjambed, enjambed, enjambed until you get to straws, which is where we finally have a stop. But I'm going to read that whole chunk so you can hear that. I peek through the cactus fence and watch the women rub oil sweeter than honey into their arms and legs, while their children jump waves or sip drinks from long straws. So this could in fact be its own sentence. It all goes together. So I have a lot of enjambment in these first 4 lines. Then we have coconut white and mango yellow. This is another example of an enjambed line. Got some punctuation after yellow. Here we have a couple more, or excuse me, I said that wrong, end stopped, sorry. Here we have some more enjambed lines. Sister has no punctuation after it, neither does sand. They all flow into one another. Taste is where your stopping point is, so this should be red. And finally, we have all these examples down here. Every single one of these lines is end stopped. And I think the reason why the author or the poet decided to do this is because this is a very important stanza. They want to stop after each line and make you think about what the mother is saying. It's very important to the meaning of the poem. But yes, this is this whole assignment. Again, I know we did this together in class, but maybe you missed this or want to practice on this. This is a very important part of your unit final. So if any of this does not make sense to you at all, please ask me about it. I want to make sure you feel prepared to do this stuff on your own on Monday.